No, come here. Okay. I think that this is an amazing image, and I may just film my entire video like this, although that might be a little bit distracting to you. Emily, come look at it.
Are you videotaping right now? Whoa!
Okay, but I could also just be like this. Ah! Hi. Alright, so I'm talking about Van Maanen. First thing I'm going to talk about is realist tales. So realist tales are generally written in third-person voice, and they're most interested in the authenticity of cultural representations. So there's 4 conventions that mark the realist tale as realist. First is that there is experiential author or authority, so there's complete absence of the author. The author is rendered as this kind of like godlike view that knows everything, that's presence is legitimated by fact that they are the ethnographer. So they, the subjectivity kind of becomes moot in this mode of realist telling. It's told from an institutional voice, like I said, that is legitimated by nature of just being the ethnographer, and so the status of the field worker is really what marks them as expert. They collect objective data that are supposedly uncontaminated by personal biases, and typically, so there's that. Then the typical forms is the second convention, and so that just means that the realist tales are interested in mundane details of everyday life. So there's little that's told about particular experiences of the people that are studied, but there's a lot of information about the categories or institutions that are said to order the lives of the people in the culture that the ethnographer is studying. So details and immediacy are key for the realist tales. The native's point of view is also an important convention here, so there should be some accounts and explanations by members of the culture. So there's some a lot of closely edited quotations that the ethnographer will use and put into the writing. So they'll offer their perspective, but they're also offering the perspective of the people who practice, people that are members of this culture. Interpretive omnipotence is also important in the realist tale, so basically the ethnographer has the final word on how the culture is going to be interpreted and presented. So like I said earlier, with that kind of God's eye view thing. Other things, so the realist tale offers one reading, and it culls its facts carefully to support that reading. So it's like, here's one reading, one way in which the culture can be interpreted, and all of the information that the realist writer, the realist ethnographer, the ethnographer that writes in the realist form, all of the information that they include in their ethnography will be information to support whatever view of culture they're trying to present to their readers. So the narrator speaks for the group that is studied. They speak as a passive observer who kind of just roams imperialistically across the setting and tells events that happen. The next type of tales that Van Maanen discusses are they're the confessional tales. So in the confessional tales, you have these really highly personalized style of writing. They're really self-absorbed, and it was kind of a response to some of the realist tales, and it shows really what it's interested in is showing the technique of practice, so what it's like to be in the field. And typically these are kind of characteristic of it's these like accounts of like they found errors in the ways that they were living, and now they, have studied this new culture and they view the world differently or whatever. So that's kind of the nature of the realist tale. In the realist tale, the ethnographic report is more important, and it's like and it's a personal document. So it's about the experience of the ethnographer, and they're really, again, trying to highlight what happened in the field. So trying to expose that framework. So it's in that way, it is a response to the realist tales that are like, the author is omnipotent, and there's this institutionalized authorial voice. So this confessional tale is a response to that, where it's like, we're gonna kind of show you the backbones of this thing and show you what really happened. It's a little bit more storytelling, not as much as impressionistic maybe. So there's no longer a disembodied voice of culture. So basically, it's these kind of self-explanatory accounts of how the author conducted a piece of research that they reported elsewhere. So there's two ways that the confessional author orients themselves. So they may possibly do this as though they're a student of the observed and they've come to learn something about the culture, or they'll do this as a translator or an interpreter of some like indigenous text or something. So these confessional tales, unlike the realist tales, rarely portray the author as passive. The field worker's point of view is really essential here, because that's what's being represented in this type of ethnographic tale or document. The point of view being represented is that of the field worker. So it's like they saw things one way at the beginning, and then they saw them an entirely different way at the end. And yeah, that's kind of typically what that tale looks like. Again. So naturalness is also important here. So again, it's kind of this like implied storyline about a field worker and a culture finding each other, and despite some initial misunderstandings, in the end they're like a perfect match and they learn something. So these confessional tales usually end on really upbeat, positive, sometimes self-congratulatory notes. But sometimes this confessional tale becomes kind of like an etiquette book, where field workers show how they've learned to compose themselves according to the standards and behaviors of a particular culture. And so they may produce these documents. A confessional tale may take the form of being a document that is more like a guide about how to live and get along in a particular culture, since they're really trying to expose that part of the process that realists did not in their writing. So these will kind of vary depending on how much self-reflection you are willing to offer up. Anything else important about the confessional tales? Yeah, I think that's about all that I'll probably say about that. So the next is impressionist tales, or the next types of tales that we're going to be talking about. And these tales, this type of ethnographic writing is an attempt to explicitly bring the knower, so the ethnographer, and the known, the object of study, not object, the population of study, together. So it's kind of bringing them together. So, and sometimes these stories are told just in small gatherings, and these are oral tellings and not always written tellings. And even sometimes they don't even make it into print, but these impressionist tales are kind of more about the backstage of field work. So they're figurative, they're highly personalized perspectives, and the key here is to give these impressions of what a particular moment in during the ethnographic work was like, to give kind of an impression of the moment. They use words and metaphors, and they use a lot of literary styles, and they're generally told in the first person. So it's textual identity is something that's important here. So the form of the impressionist tale is dramatic recall. So events are recounted a bit roughly, and they're in, maybe or maybe not in the order in which they are said to have. They are in the order in which they have been said to have occurred. And kind of the key here is to draw an audience into an unfamiliar story, so that they can see, hear, and feel the way that the field workers saw, heard, and felt in any particular moment. So just kind of an impression of a moment. In impressionistic tales, fragmented knowledge often comes up, because it's not this whole complete story, which can never really be told, Van Maanen says at the end, in ethnography. So they are just these impressions of what the culture is like. Characterization is generally pretty dense, so the field worker has to give individual voices to the characters, and since this does borrow literary forms, that's an important quality here. And then dramatic control, the audience can't be concerned whether or not the story is correct. It's not so much about that as it is about giving an impression of a moment, about, you know, activating the senses of the reader as though they were there in that moment as well. And it's important to remember here that the standards for creating this type of tale, the Impressionist tale, is not disciplinary. So again, it is literary that are kind of the standards for forming this type of tale. So you want to keep the audience alert, you want to keep the audience interested. Sometimes these Impressionist tales are enclosed within a confessional tale or even a realist tale, maybe more so often a confessional tale, and they're generally done in essay form. And again, oral telling is really important and really common with Impressionist tales. So, because they can stand alone, they don't really need to masquerade as anything other than stories. So they're kind of transparent about simply being stories and not trying to add too many other things in there. So they kind of just let all these odd facts kind of coalesce into one narrative. Van Maanen at the end of this chapter ends up saying that fieldwork at its core, this is a quote from page 117, is a long social process of coming to terms with a culture. It is a process that begins before one enters the field and continues long after one leaves. And this is also the chapter in which he notes that field notes are incomplete and insufficient. So trying to create them into some type of tale will always be incomplete and insufficient no matter what the tale claims, or even if the tale claims otherwise. After this, he goes on to talk about fieldwork and culture and kind of revisits fieldwork and culture and ethnography, saying that throughout the book, his concern has been with different literary and rhetorical devices that are used to represent the results of fieldwork. So, and he kind of like goes again into kind of naming some of the problems with each of these. So realist tales today no longer treat observation alone the way that some previous generations did. And then he goes on to talk about some new other types of tales. So there's the critical tales, which their aim and their goal is to shed light on larger social, political, symbolic, or economic issues. They often have a Marxist edge, although they don't have to, but at times they do because they are interested in analyzing social structures through the eyes of disadvantaged groups in advanced capitalist countries. So while they don't always take a Marxist slant, it is common in critical tales that they will. And then they also import information from other disciplines whenever that can help advance their work. Formal tales tend to build, test, and generalize or otherwise exhibit theory. So less concerned with political economy, it's more structuralist in nature, and it's interested in producing or creating theory. And then you have literary tales, so that's borrowing a lot from literature and emphasis on creating stories. So characterization is really dense here, dramatic plots, even flashbacks. The story in the literary tale is really emotionally charged. So the author may have this kind of half-hidden kind of nature about themselves where they allow their presence to be known as author, and then at times it isn't, or they can just kind of be a filter through which things are happening. But regardless of what stance the author takes in a literary tale, it's really clear that there's just one single voice shaping this creative work. One critique of the literary tale is that it can just kind of be all fluff, and that because it is just literary and there is no kind of theory. So in a disciplinary setting, that can be kind of read as just being fluff. Then there's the jointly told tales, in which the ethnographer's tale is told in conjunction with or up next to the tale of the native. So that's another kind, but often it's said that those don't really read too much like ethnographies. So those are just kind of the three main tales, and then a couple more that I wanted to talk about as well. So yeah, that's it. Happy Saturday.